happening, man? Welcome to the show. I've been very excited to have you on for this topic for a long time, and just pumped to really get
Absolutely.
into it today. So let's
Yeah.
if people are unfamiliar with you and your work and what you do, give them a little bit of a background. I'll do a little intro for you or something like that, and we'll put some stuff in the show notes.
All
But
right.
if people living under a rock, they don't know who you are. Let's give them a little break.
Sure thing. All right. Well, I grew up playing sports, pretty scholastically too. So I was into, human biology. My dad was a biology teacher. Had a good wrestling career in high school, played football, uh, loved lifting weights, did powerlifting, went on to Michigan State, was on the wrestling team, was a 4-year starter, NCAA qualifier, all that stuff. And that's when I started to get even more into the science of, say, nutrition, sports science. I mean, I majored in kinesiology, so kind of like exercise physiology type stuff, but also started getting into a lot of the sports performance nutrition back then, which then translated into future desires after undergrad. And I was actually the strength and nutrition coach for a year while I was applying to med school. And I have an aunt, my mom's younger sister, is a cardiologist. And when my younger brother and I, Spencer, who's well known in the social media circles, when we were visiting her and talking about all this stuff, we were talking about nutrition and insulin and all this stuff. And she goes, "Well, geez, seems like you should be an endocrinologist." And so I was like, "Oh, okay." I didn't really know what that meant. And when I went to med school, when we did that section of endocrinology, the other things, not just obesity, diabetes, et cetera, and nutrition, but the other hormone axes and the negative feedback loops and all that stuff, it just happened to make a lot of sense to me. So I did really well in it. Somewhat serendipitously, I guess. It was, a little bit lucky, because a lot of people didn't get it. And ultimately went on to, internal medicine residency in the Navy, and actually got certified in obesity medicine first after I graduated, finished internal medicine residency, and did a couple of years as an internist for the Navy before I went up to Walter Reed Military Medical Center for endocrinology fellowship, and already had that background of obesity expertise, nutrition, and then also I'm very fortunate that some national leaders in some of our big professional organizations then took me under their wing and got me involved in, writing obesity guidelines and giving presentations and stuff like that. And, then my younger brother and I have tried to work on, public education and fighting quackery. We have our Docs Who Lift podcast, where we talk about some of this stuff from our perspective. Probably have to get you to get on ours then, and share the wealth and everything like that. And now I'm starting a new endocrine department at my local hospital system, Holland Hospital. And so we're going to really try to build a new endocrine, diabetes, obesity, metabolic, big comprehensive center. So that's where I am now.
That's very, very cool. And I find that what we're going to talk about today is like, mostly the weight loss medications, GLP-1 agonists, that this might be, and maybe I'm overstating it. Maybe it's just recency bias, but it feels like there might be the greatest disconnect with like what you are doing in a clinical setting, like actually treating patients, going through the right channels, doing this the right way with monitoring. And we're going to go through what that process looks like. And it's such a big stretch to what like the average person thinks of these things. I know that there's always a big gap between like a layperson understanding of something and what goes on in more of a clinical setting, but it feels like there's just such a huge gap. I made a post recently, just like basic understanding of this stuff, and it blew my mind that basic, very basic post was like incredible news to people, especially because this stuff's been out for a long, like it's not like a new drug, and we're going to talk about that. And so what I'd like, very broad stroke, surface level stuff, like what is a GLP agonist? How does it work? We're going to talk about potentially differerences between GLP-1 agonist, semaglutide, and tirzepatide in a bit, but I think the ones people have heard about, wegovy and all of that stuff. Let's just start with the physiology, the science behind it.
Sure.
What are they? How do they work, and how long have they been around?
Yeah, so the way I describe it to patients is that, we have these glucagon-like peptide hormones, GLP-1 hormones, that come from our intestines. That's basically how I describe it. And there we go. And And what they do is, is they participate in our overall sugar regulation system and weight and energy balance regulation system. But when we obesity and diabetes has a broad spectrum of genetic background. Do you want me to do something about that?
I can't. I actually can't hear it all that much.
Okay, good. Okay,
it's totally fine for me.
Okay, good. So when people are then struggling with obesity and type 2 diabetes, these hormones that are supposed to work for us aren't working that well for us. And so over time, a long time ago at this point now, researchers were trying to harness it. And we actually learned a lot from bariatric surgery because these hormones increased after like gastric bypass surgery. And it was noted that they help play a role in some of the benefits for appetite and glucose regulation. And so what they do is they essentially go up into the hypothalamus. We have something called the arcuate nucleus that has a couple of receptors. I don't know how specific people want to learn about this, but this is what really regulates our appetite, cravings, satiety, and metabolism. There are two different parts to it. And we have, leptin is a hormone that comes from our adipose tissue, and it plays a role on both sides of this. It's supposed to improve our satiety, communicate to our brain that we have enough energy and that we need to quit eating, right? Basically. The same thing with the GLP-1 hormone and then ultimately these GLP-1 receptor agonists. So they go up to the hypothalamus, they improve our satiety, reduce our reward system a little bit, decrease palatability of food. And then they also work on the pancreas and in a glucose dependent manner, meaning they don't just tell the pancreas to make a bunch of insulin. Like we do have medications that do that, but they only work like as needed. So they don't cause people to have low sugars. They slow gastric emptying. Okay. So that's an important thing to think about. So it slows everything down. Worked on the liver and glucagon to help with sugar regulation out of the liver. So that's kind of the basics. And then, when we start talking about tirzepatide, which is a dual agonist, it also includes the other one called GIP. And they seem to have similar actions. There's still a little bit of a mystery wrapped in a riddle exactly how all these different things work, and the stuff that's in the pipeline is very interesting because sometimes they're agonists, antagonists, and they all seem to be working. It's very interesting, and even the researchers are kind of saying, well, geez, I don't know why this is working more than that one or whatever, but there are certainly theoretical concepts coming out, so we'll see, but that's the basics of it.
Yeah, and I'm definitely interested in your take on what will ultimately become of tirzepatide and semaglutide, and just moving forward in terms of treatment for obesity. But I find it interesting, and love to hear you talk about how this. You mentioned, okay, it has slows gastric emptying, signals to the hypothalamus that we're feeling satiated, but that's not necessarily originally what the point was. I mean, you mentioned how it acts on the pancreas to help with insulin production. Yeah. That correct me if I'm wrong and taking a run with it, but that was originally what it was, meant to treat. And so can we talk a little bit about, hey, this is how this drug came about, and then this is how it came from maybe being a diabetes-based, treatment into something that is now being treated for obesity or used to treat obesity?
So I was still in medical school when exenatide, known as Byetta, was first approved. And it was basically the newest, greatest medication. And this is the one that came from the Gila monster, the saliva. And and it did all the same things. And it's very good. And it's still, if there was nothing else, still a very good medication. Has good weight loss, has very good glycemic benefits for those with obesity complicated by type 2 diabetes. And then came the daily dose of liraglutide, which was initially known as Victoza, and that was approved for type 2 diabetes. Again, very good weight loss, very good.
Did they already know control. At that point? Did they already know at that point that it was also working for weight loss? I mean, obviously, the synergistic benefit to losing weight for insulin sensitivity and diabetic purposes. But were they already like, holy shit, this is also working for weight loss? Like that wasn't the intent. Yeah. The intent was glycemic control, better insulin production, let's say, more directly focused on that end of it. And then they were like, oh shit, this is also, people are also losing weight. And those two things synergistically are helpful in this context.
Yeah, absolutely. So Yeah, so it was well known with the early studies that not only were people having really good sugar benefits, but
Right.
they were having weight loss benefits. So yeah, and then the liraglutide, the Victoza, was even better even for the weight, and so that was very well noted. And so that was actually approved when I was in residency, like around 2010 or so. And then not so long after that, I think it was, like 2014 or so, is when the higher dose of that was approved specifically for obesity, regardless of type 2 diabetes kind of thing. And because at that higher dose, it was having, really good weight loss. And again, not as good as what we're going to talk about today, because the things have gotten better. But the company that makes liraglutide then ultimately ended up making the weekly semaglutide, initially approved at lower dose than what we use now for type 2 diabetes. And it had even better weight loss benefits. And people were doing really well. And then that was approved. Initially, so the type 2 diabetes drug brand name was Ozempic. And then it was approved at the higher dosing for obesity under the brand name of Wegovy just a few, now it's been several years ago, I guess, but time flies.
And it also if you're listening to this podcast, it might not feel like this stuff's been around for years. This might be the first time you've heard about it. And so I think even just reiterating what you just said, where the actual drug name or the actual name is semaglutide, but has been branded for obesity under the brand name Wegovy, and it's been branded under for treatment of diabetes under Ozempic. And so if you see semaglutide, Ozempic, Wegovy, like it's not exactly they're not exact synonymous, but they're more or less, two versions of the drug meant to treat two different things, taken in two different amounts and dosage, and they have different protocols, but we're talking about utilization of the same drug here.
Yeah. And it's interesting. It actually drives me and a lot of other people crazy about how, the awareness of this stuff just kind of blew up recently, even though these have been around for a while because of social media, I think. And then the media grabbed onto it, and then people are using them. There's some inappropriate use for sure. And it's become almost inappropriately popular, maybe a little too much.
Absolutely.
It's good that there's awareness, but then it's, the awareness that's been raised is a little bit inappropriate. So so there have been some problems. So it seems new to people, but we've been using these medications for, God, I hate to even say, well over 15 years. I can't believe that.
Was liraglutide or any of those ever approved for the treatment of obesity?
So liraglutide was. So like I said, initially Victoza in about 2010 was when I was in residency, and then a few years later, 2014, at a higher dose called Saxenda. So same medicine, same exact thing, approved at a higher dose, just like Ozempic and Wegovy. Right. And it's just that the weekly shot semaglutide, whereas liraglutide's the daily one, it just does even better for weight loss. I mean, there was even just a trial published last year, head-to-head comparison. Like there were a bunch of other smaller little trials, but where the people in the placebo group on average, of course, this gets real heterogeneous, right? Everyone has different responses, but the placebo group had about 2% weight loss with their lifestyle. The daily liraglutide group, that's at the dose of Saxenda, was 6.5% weight loss, and the weekly semaglutide, which is Wegovy, was almost 16% weight loss. This was relatively small compared to some of the big trials, but they just wanted to have this head-to-head comparison with the full doses straight up, just so people could see. And that's pretty remarkable. I mean, and when we talk about how much weight loss we're getting and why we care, it's really about what's on the inside that counts, right? This weight loss correlates to clinical goals. So when you start getting over 5%, that's why they approve these medications when a lot of people get over 5% weight loss, because you see a lot of clinical benefits. 7%, 10%, you start getting over that and you're getting really good clinical benefits like metabolic syndrome, prediabetes remission or diabetes prevention. You're starting to improve fatty liver, preventing NASH, sleep apnea benefits. You start getting over 15% and we're really starting to talk about remitting a lot of these diseases. And you don't have to get down to normal, what we call normal or, ideal weight or anything like that. But that's why that's so important, these numbers.
Yeah. And I think we'll talk about like how long, at some point we're going to get to how long you should be on these drugs. And it does come back to like, well, what's the goal? of taking this, in all likelihood, it isn't a weight goal, it's a clinical goal, of which weight is
Yep.
plays a part for sure. Are you are
Hmm.
you at a point with, from what we've seen with tirzepatide, like I'm thinking about like where I want to go with this conversation. And I'm like, okay, I want to
Hmm.
hear about semaglutide research, and I know that I've seen all of the big studies. I think they're fun to talk about, but I almost think like, are you at a point where you're like, we might waste time talking about semaglutide because tirzepatide just seems to be way better, and maybe let's use our time today to kind of pivot and maybe talk about the comparison between the two and
Sure.
why. I don't want to put words in your mouth if that is how you're feeling or not. I don't want to spend a half hour on semaglutide studies and then you'd be like, yeah, but tirzepatide's way better. And
Yeah.
we,
Well,
so
yeah, I
curious.
mean, and it's not like it's way better.
Correct.
It's head to head, and we'll talk about some of the head to head trials or that have been done. These are both, people will call these, say, second generation obesity and diabetes medications, because they're just at another level now. But also remember, everyone's different, right? There are different tolerances. And we can go over those, and so sometimes we go back and forth. Sometimes it's an insurance thing. I'll say that we have very good cardiovascular outcome trials for liraglutide when it was used as at the dose of Victoza for people with type 2 diabetes and established cardiovascular disease. So that's important to know, and why the higher dose Saxenda would be preferred for someone with obesity and cardiovascular disease. We also have that for semaglutide. We don't yet exactly have that for tirzepatide, but I will say that an analysis of all the phase 3 trials thus far, now they're relatively short, right? They're not cardiovascular outcome trials, but it certainly shows that we're expecting the benefit, which would make sense. Because again, when you start getting over that 10-15% weight loss, as long as there's not some adverse effect of the medication, that type of weight loss is what gets us the cardiovascular benefits. And so, plus the mechanism of action, we expect it to have those benefits. So it should have that, but that is just something to consider, that we consider when we're talking about an individual. But yeah, so tirzepatide, it's a dual agonist. So it's glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide and GLP-1 receptor agonist. It's one molecule. It's not two molecules. It's one molecule. And just for example, so last year, let's see, when was this published? 2021 or 2021, they did publish in the New England Journal of Medicine, head to head, essentially. But this was in people with type 2 diabetes. So this wasn't comparing tirzepatide or Mounjaro to Wegovy. It was actually comparing it to the modest or even low dose Ozempic or semaglutide. And it was almost 2,000 patients. They had relatively high A1C. Do you or your followers know what A1C is?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so it basically is just a marker of red blood cells and their sugar, and it gives us an idea of what average blood sugars are. So these guys had almost 8.5% A1Cs, which is pretty high. We like A1Cs to be under 7 for long-term sugar control stuff. Sometimes 6.5 or even better. And the bottom line, so they did this for like a year, and you have to titrate up all these medications because of nausea. Okay, so we'll talk about some of those side effects. But so you got to slowly titrate up. And the average A1C reduction was over 2% for the low dose tirzepatide, 2.25, and then 2.3 for the higher dose tirzepatide, and it was 1.9 for the 1 milligram semaglutide. So again, we could argue there is a 2 milligram Ozempic dose that's probably going to be a little bit closer to the 5 milligram tirzepatide if we had to do it. But so these are all good, right? That 2% A1C reduction from just over 8, that's remarkable on average. That's really good clinical benefit. And a lot of people met their goals. Almost 90% of people on all these doses got to an A1C of under 7%. But then let's talk about the weight loss. So again, these are type 2 diabetes. People with type 2 diabetes do struggle with weight loss compared to those without type 2 diabetes, even pre-diabetes. It's just a harder pathophysiology to get at. And so the weight loss in kilograms, which is about the same as percent in these studies, because everyone seems to be about 100
around 100 kilograms.
kilograms.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
The semaglutide 1 milligram got about 6% weight loss. And we know that would be a little bit more in the studies that compare, say, 2.4 semaglutide to 1, or the 2 to the 1, a little bit better weight loss with those higher doses. But then the tirzepatide doses, so 5 milligrams got 7.5 kilograms weight loss, 9.5 with the 10 milligram dose, and 11 kilograms with the 15 milligram dose. So that, that's pretty darn remarkable. And that's in type 2 diabetes. That's where we start to see really good clinical benefits.
Just a quick pit stop. When we're talking about the relationship between the words semaglutide and Wegovy and Ozempic, where semaglutide is the drug and Ozempic and Wegovy are the brand names. When we're talking about tirzepatide, it's currently branded under the brand name Mounjaro for treatment of type 2 diabetes. Yep.
Yeah. So tirzepatide is Mounjaro, and it is approved for type 2 diabetes currently.
Yes.
We certainly have data that we'll talk about where it was studied in people with obesity without type 2 diabetes, and is very much expected to be approved this year for obesity without type 2 diabetes. How they decide to do the branding, because this gets complicated, and between the FDA and the insurance companies, they're all working against us, because it'd be nice to have these options a little bit more readily available for patients.
Yeah, and you mentioned, not briefly, but I think we could, for the person who's not necessarily grasping the magnitude of what you just said in terms of A1C reduction and weight loss as an independent variable potentially, like, could you speak a little bit to the fact, or just could we reiterate and highlight how ridiculous what you just said is in terms of like what kind of weight loss people are seeing over what time frame with what sort of we can talk about maintaining those changes, whether it's A1C or reduction in weight loss whilst on the drug. But if you were like trying to get somebody to understand how big of a deal some of this is with the research that we have, can we speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah. So, if you look at all the placebo-controlled trials for weight loss medications for people with obesity or even type 2 diabetes, they always get what we would consider pretty good, decent basic diet and exercise recommendations. They're not intensive, okay? So, but they're usually only losing, on average, 1 to 2%. Now, again, there's individual variability, right? Some people respond very well. They're like, oh, they get an aha. They're able to make those changes. But obesity pathophysiology makes it hard. It's easier said than done. And again, everyone has they lie in a different spot on the spectrum of genetics that's working against them. They have different exposure to our obesogenic environment, different medications, different, medical conditions, et cetera. But on average, it's like 1 to 2% weight loss for these placebo groups that are getting lifestyle recommendations. When we have, sometimes, we have intensive lifestyle programs like the diabetes prevention program, the Look Ahead program. And then there are a couple of these obesity medication trials that had an intensive lifestyle arm. There's actually a very interesting one that we can talk about with the wegovy stuff. But those usually get, around 5, 6, 7% weight loss on average. Okay. And that's pretty good for lifestyle. The problem is, ultimately, the body works against us. You've heard about the set point, that area in the hypothalamus we talked about. It drives hunger. There's metabolic adaptation that works against us, and people regain their weight, even though they're still trying. And that's the problem. That's why we'll get into how technically these medications are approved for long-term use. But that's it. That's like the thing. And so for example, if people want to look up step 3, which was semaglutide, it was published in JAMA in 2021. They compared 2.4 milligrams of semaglutide, which is Wegovy, to intensive lifestyle therapy. So instead of getting that 1 to 2% weight loss with the placebo arm, they got about 6%, which is pretty darn good. Interestingly, the semaglutide group got over 16% weight loss, which is 10% more than the placebo, more than the intensive lifestyle group. But here's the kicker, and for lifestyle like shills like us, this is very interesting, because the absolute amount of weight loss with the semaglutide in that was very similar to the other trials that did not have the intensive lifestyle arm, even as the baseline for the semaglutide group. And so, really what it seems to do, even in those with just very basic lifestyle recommendations, it just really supports the person's ability to stick to those basics. They don't even need that intensive. And by intensive, I mean, they're having weekly visits at first, every other week visits, with counselors, behavioralists, meal replacement shakes, etc. And so that's what's really remarkable, is that the medications help them do well with just the basic diet and exercise recommendations without the intensive lifestyle efforts.
16% weight loss is crazy. I mean,
Yeah.
that is when I say crab, it's an incredibly meaningful, clinically speaking, meaningful amount.
Yeah.
People in these studies tend to average around 100 kilos. We're talking like somewhere between like 30 and 40 pounds if we're looking at that percentage, something like that. That is just like, and you said intense lifestyle intervention sees like 6-7%. Do we see anything come close to what these medications are doing in terms of weight reduction? Let's talk specifically. I think it's important to differentiate A1C reduction, weight loss reduction. They're synergistic to some degree, for sure. But I think from a weight loss perspective, do we see anything close?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Bariatric surgery.
Yeah, right. Okay, exactly.
Gastric sleeves and root-wide gastric bypass. But no, not from lifestyle or medications other than these. Yeah. So no, it's outstanding. And then the other thing I talk about when I give these talks to people is looking at those categorical weight losses. So how many people get over 5%, 10%, 15, and 20%? And just for example, there was in step 3 with the semaglutide. It was like 80% of people got over 10% weight loss, and almost 2/3 of people got over 15% weight loss. 40% of people got over 20% loss. We didn't even used to have on these publications the 20% category, because it was like nothing. Like the placebo group, it's like nothing. It's like single digits. So, but although on the other hand, it is nice to know that some people can actually respond to the lifestyle therapy. So, so we have to keep that in mind too. Some people we can just educate and they can do well, but.
So when we're looking at the difference between semaglutide and tirzepatide is GLP-1 and GIP. And it is my understanding that it is also a much less like potent dose of GLP. And it is maybe a quarter as potent potentially, and compared to semaglutide might be a little bit more like half as potent. And those numbers and verbiage might be incorrect. I'd love to hear your take, but we don't need to go so deep into it, but I am curious as to, okay, we are seeing right now that tirzepatide seems to be performing a little bit better than semaglutide in the research, and potentially even on average less side effects as well. Again, up for your contention there for sure. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'd be interested in a little bit, maybe just selfishly, a little bit of like a theory or what we know about why that might be. And do you think that we're gonna, like we've moved on, quote unquote, maybe from liraglutide to semaglutide, are we gonna see that same kind of like leaving semaglutide in the past a little bit, moving on to something? Is this 3.0 here, or are both of these going to be living?
Yeah, no, I think they're both going to be available. And like I said, there's more in the pipeline. But yeah, in the trial that came out last year with tirzepatide, the amount of weight loss was even better. I mean, it just was. It's very good. And we're really talking about even more people achieving that 10, 15, and 20% weight loss. And with that comes all the cardiometabolic benefits from that with the tirzepatide. And it will be approved this year for weight loss, specifically in people with obesity, whether they have type 2 diabetes or not. And the side effects, it's hard to say. Some of those things you were talking about, because it's a dual agonist. It's not like two separate molecules put together. I've seen some interesting debate, on that, to be honest. And so I don't necessarily want to dig into those weeds per se, just because it almost doesn't matter. Like who cares? It doesn't matter in the real life. And so to talk about, the trial that was published last year in New England Journal of Medicine, just for example. So again, this is in people with obesity. So we talked about the one with type 2 diabetes comparing semaglutide and tirzepatide.
Can I pause you for 1 second on that?
Go ahead.
So So when they're picking a cohort to study, if it's people with diabetes or people with obesity, is the point of this study was to pick people who have obesity without diabetes so that
Yes.
they could objectively look at it as a treatment for just obesity. That was kind of the point.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. Yep. And and they do that for all these, for liraglutide at the higher dose compared to the lower dose that was for type 2 diabetes. And in fact, they generally exclude type 2 diabetes for these just to show, but they include pre-diabetes, which is important because we're showing diabetes prevention. So if we can start treating the higher risk people, by the way, people with obesity, metabolic syndrome, high triglycerides, low HDL, high blood pressure, pre-diabetes, which is impaired fasting glucose, just a little bit high levels of that, on that spectrum of, we'll call it dysglycemia, but they haven't lost their pancreas function to the point of having true hyperglycemia that leads to ultimate complications. But fatty liver, all these complications of obesity, just not type 2 diabetes, because it is a little bit different animal at that point. But it's important to check in these patients. And so last year, we had all those tirzepatide trials really published like in 2021, which led to its approval for type 2 diabetes. So last year was the SURMOUNT-1 trial that was published around, we're getting close to it, about a year ago. And I love to name Anya Yasserboff because I've worked with her and she was the lead author of this. So it's really cool. She's like a rock star. And so again, they did, basic lifestyle interventions, placebo group got a little over 2%. Actually, it was like 2.5% to 3% for those who really completed the trial weight loss. So again, pretty good placebo group. The 5 milligram dose of tirzepatide on average got 16% weight loss. The 10 milligram dose was over 21% weight loss. And actually, the 15 milligram dose wasn't a lot higher. It was 22.5% weight loss. But that is just absolutely unremarkable. That's 19 to 20% placebo subtracted, meaning almost 20% more than what the lifestyle intervention group got with those higher doses of tirzepatide. And then again, that categorical weight loss, where we really see these benefits, over 2/3 of those higher dose, the people in the higher doses got 15% weight loss, and over half got 20% weight loss. Remember I said, well, geez, we didn't even used to have the 20% weight loss category. Well, in this, over 1/3 of people in those higher doses got 25% weight loss. It's just nuts. Now that's really knocking on the door of bariatric surgery. And again, the pipeline is cooking and there's more coming, and we'll see. I hope now that the Pandora's box has been opened and we're going to get safety and efficacy data, more competition, because the other thing we need cost reduction. And that's a huge problem, because for right now, it's really only the highest risk people, those with metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, bad sleep apnea, et cetera, and then of course type 2 diabetes, who get the most bang for the buck of these medications. If they were dirt cheap, then all those people using it to lose a little bit of weight, maybe wouldn't be out of the realm. You know what I mean? But for now, that's totally not indicated. And there are still side effects. There's still drugs. They are medications. So we really shouldn't take medications unless we absolutely have great benefit to risk ratio.
Let's talk a little bit about how does one qualify for this medication? How does somebody go through the right channels to get this medication? What it costs for somebody? And then let's move into some of the side effects of the drugs.
Yeah. So anybody who has obesity and type 2 diabetes, really should be considered for these medications, assuming cost and coverage are appropriate, because they are expensive. They're around $1,000 or even more a month in the United States, by the way. So that's a whole nother debate that we'll skip that one for today. But then, and then insurance coverage is even more difficult for the higher doses that are approved for weight loss, for obesity. But really, those people who have obesity, they've struggled. Anybody who gets referred to me has tried plenty of times nutrition and exercise efforts, and again, that the physiology of obesity works against them. So, and the higher the risk, the higher the severity of the disease of obesity, based upon the complications, the more benefit they'll get. Thus, the better cost effectiveness of these medications, right? And so, yeah, someone with a little bit of excess weight, but they're very healthy, and we could even argue maybe don't even truly have clinical obesity based upon, say, BMI, exam, waist circumference, all that stuff, and they're metabolically healthy, I mean, they shouldn't be taking these medications. And I know that's happening. I know it's happening. I hear it all the time. Unfortunately, out in Hollywood, all that stuff. But they're still drugs. They do still have potential, side effects, and that gets you to your next question. And a lot of people get some nausea, some diarrhea, vomiting, constipation. The GI side effects of these are the most prominent. Now, I tell patients if they can weather the storm, generally it's going to resolve and they're going to be able to tolerate it okay. But they do have to slowly titrate up the dose. Sometimes on an individual basis, we have to do all sorts of things, keep them on a lower dose. We have some little tricks of the trade to help them with that stuff. Generally speaking, in all these trials, though, the dropout rate, because of the side effects, is actually pretty low, because they're having good benefits usually. So, but it can be anywhere from 5 to 15% dropout rate for these types of medications. But all the benefits really outweigh those risks. Some of the other actual side effects, concerning side effects that people have heard about that may or may not be true, like pancreatitis. So people have heard about pancreatitis. There's been a concern with all these medications because of some associations seen in some studies. We know it's working on the pancreas, but in all the meta-analyses, it really doesn't look like there's an increased risk of pancreatitis from the medications. It does look like there's a small but statistically significant increased risk of, say, gallbladder disease. And gallstones, of course, can lead to pancreatitis, but so can obesity, type 2 diabetes, and rapid weight loss. So, but that's still a very small number, the gallbladder disease, but it's still something to think about.
I think it's just helpful to acknowledge that there's not zero risk, and so the less healthy you are, the better that risk to reward ratio is.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you are, by all accounts, by all objective clinical accounts, healthy, then the risk reward ratio just there's not much of a reward outside of, potentially, like, I don't want to be, vanity weight, outside of just looking,
right.
Talking about clinical health markers here. There seems to not be a huge benefit for you. Short in terms of short-term side effects, we're looking at things like GI distress and nausea. And in terms of long-term side effects, you mentioned some of the things just now. How if someone says, okay, I'm listening to you, I'm going to be a little nauseous and I get a little GI distress, but like, to me, that's worth it. I just want to lose some weight and I don't mind. Some people would classify the nausea as like part of the deterrent to eat. Thus,
However, to that point though, it actually, in all the trials, nausea is not correlated with the weight loss success.
Gotcha.
So
like
they continue to, right. So actually the mechanism of action is not the nausea. Correct. And so people who don't get nausea do just as well. And that's a good point. I was going to bring that up. It's because that's a common misconception. People think, oh God, well, of course they're losing weight. They're nauseous all the time. It actually has nothing to do with it. Looking at the big picture. So that is important to know. And plus, once that nausea resolves, they still continue to do well long term.
It's more the fullness than the
yes, it's that the good satiety, the decreased in the food seeking behavior, the palatability and all that stuff. But we do have there's one other thing that people always ask about, and that's the thyroid cancer. So there's a black box warning because when they were studied in rodents have higher numbers of C cells in their thyroid. So not like the classic type of thyroid cancer that we see most commonly, which is actually pretty low risk. This gets into something called medullary thyroid cancer. So rodents have more C cells. They also have more GLP receptors on their C cells, and there was some concern of that. This has not panned out in humans. There was a case control cohort published earlier this year that made it look like, well, maybe there's an increased risk of all sorts of thyroid cancers. But it didn't have the right controls. And so, they were just finding more. If we started screening everyone for thyroid cancer, we'd find a lot more. It happened in South Korea several years ago when they just started doing ultrasounds on everyone, and their thyroid cancer incidence went way up. But again, most thyroid cancers are not really that high risk. And, the complications were still like really, really minimal. So that's that part. And as far as like kind of mitigating the side effects, especially the nausea and the GI stuff, there was a nice guidance published in the journal Clinical Medicine just this year, clinical recommendations to manage the GI adverse events in people treated with GLP-1 receptor agonists. And, talk about eating habits, eating slowly, only really if you're hungry. don't force yourself to eat. You don't have to eat. We need to make sure people get their nutrition. Don't lie down after meals. Stop when you feel satiated. So my dad many years ago went and refereed some wrestling in Japan, and he came back and he came out, he decided to always use this little catchphrase where it's called a Harry Hachibu, where you're just like satisfied. And every time we'd all overeat, he'd go, I'm a wee past Harry Hachibu. So you don't go past Harry Hachibu. So when you're satiated, stop. Sometimes maybe increased small meal frequency in these cases can be helpful. And also food composition. So instead of being like, say, going keto and having unlimited amounts of fat, especially greasy, saturated fat type stuff, then, a lot of them do that. You really probably want to cut down your fat and have maybe a little bit lower fat. Avoid greasy stuff, avoid restaurant foods. Those are kind of some of the best prevention strategies I think that came out of this.
What's the longest term study we have on any of these medications? Because I'm just thinking about, okay, we have short term, and you could say these are like discomfort things that are like GI distress, nausea, but like, you just touched on a couple of the things that, thyroid cancer, some of them that might seem like, okay, maybe we need to worry about them, but are there things like what evidence, what length of time have people been on this, and that we've looked at them what do we really think are the long-term potential downsides?
Yeah. So, randomized controlled trials, they don't go that long, right? I mean, there's not enough money to do that. For example, we do have just recently published was a 2-year randomized controlled trial for semaglutide, and it showed the weight maintenance of over 12.5% compared to a little bit of regain of that, 2 down to 1% weight loss for the placebo group. Talked about, improved body weight, cravings, and better control of eating over the 2 years. As far as safety, though, we do have a lot of monitoring of the patients who have been on all these different types of medicines. Like I said, exenatide going all the way back to when I was in med school, 2000, whatever it was, 2005, 6, 7, whenever that was approved. And then liraglutide approved in 2010, the higher dose approved a few years later. And then we have a bunch of other medications that are still only approved for type 2 diabetes. And so these have been monitored, not in randomized controlled trial settings, but certainly big, huge cohorts, keeping an eye on these things. Insurances do it, healthcare systems do it, drug monitoring, and certainly the companies do it too. And so far all we see are benefits and no risks, or compared to the risk. There's minimal risks, concerning risks.
Do you, I guess, hold some reservation as far as a declaration that there are none? I mean, I'm thinking
nobody should ever do that.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't know. I mean,
exactly.
We don't know what we don't know, right. And that's it certainly, because we know that they have these cardiovascular benefits, and again, this gets back to the higher the risk you have, that gets better. The more benefit we know, we really do know that the long-term benefits are going to outweigh the risks in those people. But the less risk you have, we don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. That's a very important point, though, and that is how I feel about it. Where, listen, we're talking about net. Everything is about net. And if you have more health complications and we can make those better, and then maybe we find out that there was a small downside to the, you being, but you've had such a big benefit from where you were that, the more unhealthy you are, the more benefit, the more it's worth taking the chance on something we aren't 100% sure on. Although, like you said, so far, things look like they're checking out.
Yep.
But I think that's
Absolutely.
where people really need to, when I say people, I mean those, I guess everybody need to really assess their own potential benefit. And if from a health perspective, there really are none for you, and it's just a matter of, I want to lose a couple pounds for a vacation or something, then you really are taking a chance on, like, we don't know what we're going to learn 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. And I guess that kind of brings, well, I'd like to actually, before we even talk about, do we need to be on them forever? Because that's such a huge question. Is what we've seen in the research in terms of losses in muscle, in lean body mass, and how much how much is that a concern for you? What do you talk to in terms of patients? What are you talking to them about in terms of mitigating this? How big of a deal is it? What's your level of concern? All of that.
Absolutely. So actually, Spencer and I talked about this on a recent podcast, on our Docs Who Live podcast, because a guy named Peter Attia, who's not an obesity or diabetes expert, he was making a big deal about this and kind of scaremongering about it. Any weight loss intervention ultimately results in some lean mass loss. Now, some of that's, stuff like water and things like that, but we never want anybody to lose. Yeah, we don't want anybody to lose any muscle mass. Yeah. And they took in the semaglutide trials, they took a very small part, like, a few hundred people, and did DEXA scans and stuff like that. And it was a little bit more lean mass loss than maybe what you would expect. But then even in the placebo group, there was like more lean mass loss. So, some of that didn't make any sense. And so it is concerning, but it happens in bariatric surgery. It happens in any dietary intervention. These are basically working on, essentially just supporting our dietary interventions for the weight loss, right? And so there's no mechanism as to which, these medications specifically cause muscle loss. That doesn't, there's no reason to think that. And so I know it's cliche, but as docs who lift, we want everyone to do some resistance training. So something that I think we need to prioritize is resistance training more than maybe the aerobic training, now that we have such good medications, because they're going to lose weight. Let's focus on maintaining muscle mass. And then, from the resistance training perspective, and then the other types of exercise for the health benefits, for sure.
Yeah. That's
so no, I'm not that worried about it if we do it right.
Yep. And I think I have a couple thoughts. One, I've listened to and read a lot of Peter's stuff on this, and that's where some of my thoughts come from. But I come back to nothing mechanistically is happening where this is causing muscle loss. It's that people are eating so few calories that a large calorie deficit is going to pull a little bit more from lean mass, and all the things that you would normally do to retain muscle, like you can still do those things.
Yes.
You can eat protein, you can pay attention to protein, you can do resistance training. And I think you made a great point. And I'm thinking of, shout out Steph, one of my clients who's been having really great results on wegovy. And we talk about how, when we were working on just her lifestyle adaptation, just lifestyle adjustments, that we had a nice even benefit between spending time on aerobics, spending time on resistance training. But now that calories are naturally coming down and that deficit can be created a little bit more with the intake side, it's more of like hey, both are still good, but if you only have 30 minutes, I want you to go do your resistance training sort of thing. Just kind of fall on that side of the fence. Is that something you kind of nod along?
Absolutely. And one other point to counter the Peter Attia concerns is that even in these people who, are maybe losing a little bit more muscle mass than we want, guess what? All the clinical benefits are there, right? We talked about the glycemic benefits, the lipid benefits, the blood pressure benefits. They're feeling better, their mental health benefits. So despite a little bit of lean mass loss that we don't want, they're still getting the clinical benefits that matter.
Yeah.
So again, that's the goal. It's what's on the inside that counts.
Yep. I nod along with a lot of that. And I also am always, even non-weight loss medication discussion of don't go in such a big it's a very similar discussion. Obviously, one is medication induced, another one is just, people get really worried about muscle loss in the field of body composition change. And I always think to myself, like, you have to focus on the net outcome. If somebody loses 40 pounds and some of it's lean body mass, so okay, maybe you want to limit that, but it's probably still a net win. And there's not like, I always feel like, imagine you had a client who didn't resistance train through this whole process, going on wegovy or one day, semaglutide, whatever, and they lose weight. And maybe during that time, they didn't feel great. They were a little nauseous and they were beginning to build some of these habits. Like, you can regain lean body mass later too.
Absolutely.
Muscle that you've lost is gone forever.
Right.
And if somebody, for whatever reason, there are circumstances where maybe that's like, it's going to be easier for them to not do that as much. And, they don't have as much energy because they're not eating as much. And, spending fucking 4 hours in the gym lifting isn't realistic. And that doesn't mean that person has lost muscle forever. I don't want people to lose muscle, but I also don't want you to think, hey, I lost muscle in a cut. Whatever, it's weight loss medication, just regular person doing this lifestyle related. But okay, great. Like, when you go back to eating at maintenance, whatever, this is slightly tangential, but you regain that lean body mass back.
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Let's discuss needing to be on them forever. That is the question that we will ultimately get is, hey, I'm going to, even whether I'm someone who's doing this for a couple pounds of vanity weight, which will be a direct question I ask you afterwards, is like, what do we talk about to that person? But whatever your goal is, like, if I get off it, do all the benefits just return to normal? And so do I have to be on them forever? And is that a big concern?
Yeah. So, and this gets back to the obesity pathophysiology. So any trial we've ever done where people lose weight, whether it's nutrition, exercise, etc., they lose their weight. And unfortunately, when you stop doing whatever it is, and especially the medications, you stop treating that area in the hypothalamus, the weight gain starts to come back. So, for example, in that step 3 trial we talked about, or well, one of the semaglutide trials, they actually had a run-in phase where everyone got it. And over 20 weeks, they had over 10% weight loss. Then they randomized them to continue the semaglutide or switch to placebo. The semaglutide group lost another 8%, and the placebo group started to go up. And this has been shown in every single trial of all these different types of medications. In the first one for semaglutide, once they stopped the treatment, they didn't switch them to placebo or anything, but they lost 16% of their weight. The placebo group was doing okay. They started to even regain their weight in a 52-week off treatment extension phase, and unfortunately, the people who had been on semaglutide after losing over 16% of their weight, relatively over a year, rapidly regained a significant amount of weight. They still had about 6% weight loss compared to the placebo, but they regained most of the weight, and that's been shown pretty much in all the trials. There was a cool trial several years ago with the liraglutide, or the Saxenda, where again they gave everyone. They actually enrolled anybody who could lose about 6% of their weight before medication. So this was taking essentially lifestyle responders, which was nice. And so everyone enrolled in the trial had to lose 6%, or I think the goal was like 5%, but on average they lost 6%. And then they randomized them to the high dose of liraglutide, which is Saxenda, or continued placebo. The people who continued placebo actually maintained that weight loss because, again, they were lifestyle responders, right? So they did well, they continue to do well. But the liraglutide group lost another 6% weight loss. And then at the end of that next year, they stopped that, and you can see in the graph starting to regain the weight a little bit closer to where the other lifestyle responders were. They were all lifestyle responders. So yes, basically that's why all medications approved for weight loss are going to be indicated for long-term use, because it's a long-term chronic relapsing disease state. Now, how we deal with that in the future for cost effectiveness and stuff, I have some ideas. I think maybe we can get away with lower doses, extended doses. I know there's something in the pipeline that's like a monthly dose that's supposed to be good. That might be cost effective for long-term maintenance. And so, that's something we're going to have to figure out in the future. But yes, long-term use. That's the thing.
I'm going to say something. You could tell me you agree, slightly disagree, but I'll say that to me, like, sounds like someone's like, see, you just get like, I get comments like that if I post about something like this, like, dude, the people will just gain their weight, but like, no shit, almost. Like,
yeah,
my point is, I'm not surprised that that's the case. Like, obesity is a chronic disease, and thus chronic, a chronic intervention is likely required. And if you understand what these drugs are doing, you would understand that when you take them out, that this person will go back physiologically to who they were before, and in all likelihood return to a level of hunger that they had before, like a level of lacking satiety that they had before. And again, in a free living scenario, probably go on to eat to what they were eating before, which, I mean, it just isn't a critique, in my opinion. It's a fact, potentially.
It just is what it is. Yeah.
It is what it is. And the second thing I would say is that, in that regard, in terms of it being something forever, I think it highlights the misunderstanding of the genetic component here. People think that this is like, they're like, it's not fixing their lifestyle. I'm like, you're right, it's not. And I will say something that I know I'm sitting in front of a very highly qualified doctor, so I know I probably I know I'm probably oversimplifying it, but to me, I want you to spit it up, chew it up, spit it back out to me, how you feel it. But I think of it in a way of like, hey, these people who have obesity on some level genetically are at a disadvantage, and their disadvantages through a multitude of pathways, has to do with hypothalamus, has to be maybe GLP-1 production, maybe a bunch of things. We are, with this drug, giving them something that they don't have a genetic predisposition for, in terms of a good way. They don't have those genetic components that help them feel satiated. I mean, people, you know, if you all of a sudden became 20% hungrier and 20% less satisfied with each meal you ate, I bet you eat 20% more on average.
Yeah.
So I see it as like, hey, we're giving the, like, again, I don't want, it's not completely analogous to somebody with type 1 diabetes doesn't produce insulin and we're giving them that now. But to me, it seems like, hey, we're not fixing, but we're augmenting something genetic this person doesn't do well, and it's almost leveling the playing field. Maybe it's even better than that in some way, you know, it's supernatural levels, but
the leveling the playing field is a good point. So something we all hear, and I remember hearing it for the first time from an NIH physician who came to see me when I was at Walter Reed, and he said, wow, this is what it's like to be normal. And now we hear that all the time. People all the time say, oh, this is what it's like to be able to just eat and not be obsessed with food all the time. There are people who that's all they think about, no matter what they eat and how much they eat. And they say that. They say, this is what it's like to be normal. And by the way, as far as the long-term therapy stuff, you know, a lot of the complications of obesity require long-term management medications. So hypertension, we would never just stop their blood pressure meds because their blood pressure is good on blood pressure medications, right? Same with their type 2 diabetes meds, same with their, you know, lipid medications, et cetera. But at least now we're treating the underlying root issue. Most of the time. I mean, there are obviously some, you know, other things that cause those disease states, but most of it is they're all obesity related complications. And so now we're treating the underlying root issue long term. And I'll tell you, most of our patients end up getting off a lot of other medications, blood pressure medicines being one of the primary ones. People who have type 2 diabetes and they're on insulin, we get them off insulin all the time. You know, so they reduce their other medication needs.
Yep. I see this argument of like come from two classes of people. One, people who have never worked with people who have obesity, who are, like you had said, like don't really comprehend this understanding of how hungry and the cravings and these things that are just different from you. And second is some survivorship bias, people who had obesity, maybe that did just fine with lifestyle and assume that that's how everyone else is going to respond. And I have a client who's taking the medication and we worked together for a year and a half beforehand. And we made some nice headway with lifestyle adjustments. And it was fantastic, but there was just, it is just a different scenario. And I think people need to be more compassionate towards the genetic differences here that make weight loss harder for some people than others genetically. And you know, you said, hey, this is what it feels like to be normal. I mean, the amount of iterations of that quote that I've heard of like, hey, this is what it feels like to be able to decide to stop eating, or this is what it feels like to be, you know, satiated in a meal without feeling a loss of control. Like these are just things that if you don't work with somebody in this circumstance, you just don't understand. And I think we need to be more compassionate to the genetic differences and how, you know, I will tell you, the two people in this podcast right now, you and I don't have that issue. And I think that's just, you know, I think a lot of the fucking health and fitness space, like people need to come out and remind people, like, I have a genetic advantage. I get more full than people. I get more full. My metabolism can upregulate more. I can burn, you know, I have the ability to upregulate. And so
you're right on. Everyone's different.
Yeah. And we just need to be more compassionate to those genetic differences. And I just feel like people just assume that this is only a lifestyle, personal responsibility thing. And it's not. Most people are becoming, are getting to feel the way you feel for the first fucking time. And it's powerful.
Yeah. It is. I know. That's exactly what they say. It's amazing.
Yeah. It's awesome. I mean, it's just, if you experience it all the time, so you know, but it's been, you know, I've been doing this for a decent amount of time, almost a decade. And only in the last couple of years have I had clients who have taken this, and it is, it's special. I'm not saying it's perfect or a cure all. But it's special.
Yep. You know? Nothing's perfect, but it's pretty good.
Let's speak directly to actually, before we do that, I want to ask you a question. You've been obviously shit, man. You in a clinical setting been using these drugs for a lot longer than they've been popular because Kim Kardashian takes them. But but what have you seen done personally and seen in terms of, like you said, kind of either a weaning off or reduction in the dosing? And I know that we can't generalize, but I'm curious what you've seen maybe work a little bit, not work as well, and how that's gone, how you've managed patients that maybe are on 5 years plus going on that time frame.
Yeah. So, some people have been able to sort of de-escalate the dose and get away with it. Most people have just maintained on their doses. A lot of them, and again, this gets into insurance coverage and stuff. So, you know, I obviously see a lot of patients who have type 2 diabetes and other high risk things. And so they end up on their diabetes doses regardless. I will tell you that the biggest frustrating issue is the insurance coverage stuff. So I also have plenty of people who have now been denied continuing their medications, and now they're struggling with what we just talked about: weight regain, their hunger, they're not feeling as well, they're frustrated. And
How does
it's
insurance make
unfortunate.
that?
And sometimes
How does insurance make
is
that
the
call?
insurance company, boy, that could be a whole nother podcast with someone who has more expertise than I do, because it sure is money. Um, and we also have to find a way to address why the heck they're so much more expensive here. And that again, that's a whole nother level, a little bit beyond my comprehension. I have thoughts, but it's hard to say. Insurance companies kind of try to run the show, unfortunately. Everyone has their people that they blame for why our healthcare system is so dysfunctional. I blame insurance, big insurance, government, big insurance, all that stuff. And I don't know how to fix that, but it's a problem that we run into, and very frustrating for people.
Yeah, that's something that I've yet to have that process of like wondering what will happen over the long term, and does insurance all of a sudden stop covering this and cost becomes an issue. But those are obviously those are things that we're going to have to come up against, because
Yep.
people are going to, not maybe be on it forever, but potentially be on it forever, and we got to figure that out.
Yeah, that's why I'm hoping, with all this stuff coming down the pipeline, that competition will, will help reduce the costs, have more supply. Maybe we can get some insurance, I don't know about regulation, but reforms or something, all that. Hopefully.
Yeah,
something's got to give.
And I can imagine you could go down the insurance discussion route for a long time, but I find that fascinating. Where like they also clearly aren't understanding that this is a chronic disease. Just because I'm at this current moment metabolically healthy doesn't mean I now no longer need these drugs anymore.
Yeah, there's all sorts of goofy things that happen when they start denying or taking it away.
Okay, so I want to be respectful of your time. We're already over the hour, but and I will have to have you back on for endocrine disrupting chemical discussion.
Yeah, actually, I was going to say I might send you something. The Endocrine Society has done a lot of work with endocrine disrupting chemicals, and talking about plastics and how you can kind of at least minimize exposure. That's a complicated deal, but I would, for that point, tell your listeners to check out Endocrine Society's work on endocrine disrupting chemicals, and learn a little bit about it and minimizing those risks.
Cool. I'll appreciate that. I definitely take a look at that, because I think it's just I actually feel that these things are not inert, and if somebody mentions them, they're automatically a quack, and I'm like, well,
oh no, there's a lot to it.
Yeah,
I don't necessarily know what there are some things you can do to minimize those exposures, but again, it's a complicated deal.
Correct.
No, and it's true. It's absolutely true.
Yep. Cool. All right, let's I want to close out. I want to talk directly to somebody who comes to you, and maybe they never show up. This person doesn't actually end up coming to you. They probably know better before they show up here. But somebody who's, hey, I've heard about this. I can get it through my local fucking shady wellness holistic person who just gets it off brand, off label, and I just want to lose a couple pounds before summer. Like, what are you saying to that person? What is the conversation? What would it sound like?
Yeah, so that person, I would try to explain, and I do this with all my patients. I try to teach them, in a relatively simplistic manner, of the obesity pathophysiology, the disease, and then I also talk about what we care about. Like I said, it's what's on the inside that counts. What harm is the excess or abnormally distributed adiposity doing? And if someone doesn't truly have clinical obesity, I would explain to them that that's why these medications aren't indicated in your case. Now, it might be someone who has a history of obesity and lost a lot of weight. Now they're really, really, really struggling with hunger, and they can't maintain. Now that's a little different, right? But for the cosmetic type people, I would just explain to them, and this is why, they're not indicated. Now, if they said, well, this guy down the street is going to sell me a compounded version of semaglutide that has been an issue, I would just say, that's your prerogative if that's what you want to do, and pay that. But there is zero regulation of whatever that compounded stuff is. I don't know how they're getting it. I don't know the safety of it. I don't know how it's being manufactured, if it even is true. They're obviously charging you for it just directly. There's a bunch of conflicts of interest. I wouldn't trust it. I wouldn't take it personally. And that's what I would tell that person. And I would say, look, I know, I care about your mental health, care about how you feel about yourself, but it's truly what's on the inside that counts. You're healthy. I want to help you be healthy. And that's my role as your physician.
Yeah. It goes back to risk reward. I mean, it goes back to like, we don't know, like if you want the benefits from this forever, like you're probably looking at some amount of this forever. And it doesn't seem like there's a huge on the inside benefit. And if there's on an inside risk, then okay, then that isn't tipped in your favor, probably most likely. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. That there's been super helpful discussion. I'm curious, you know, just as more comes out, as tirzepatide gets approved for obesity, what we're going to start to see. I'm curious for my own clients who are on semaglutide, who are on Wegovy, you know, what that like. It's not like all of a sudden that becomes that's become not a great, not a very helpful route intervention for them. But I'm curious if there's like going to be a big swing of like, hey, you know, see if you can switch over to this. Like, is there, if there's a big enough reason to have a client then go in and say, hey, I've heard this might be better. Should I switch to this? I mean, yeah.
So I would say no. So another thing that we didn't really touch into is that early response to therapy. So all weight loss medications, and also, like I said, lifestyle interventions. Remember I said, well, these are lifestyle responders. So anybody who seems to lose about 5% weight loss with whatever intervention in the first few months, that predicts long-term better benefits. So even in like lifestyle, you know, they can lose 5% of their weight in the first few months. The studies show more like 8, 9, 10% weight loss, you know, over a year. Same with some of the other medications that are not as potent as these. And so, you know, if someone on, you know, say Wegovy has lost 16% of the weight, they've maybe remitted their metabolic syndrome, or their, you know, their diabetes is in sort of remission. I put that in air quotes as you, because that gets funky. Then I would not change it, because I wouldn't want to fix what's not broken. Now, on the other hand, let's say they've lost 9% of their weight. They've done well on Wegovy, but they still have, you know, a lot of complications that they haven't quite put in remission. We still need to use other medications to treat those complications. Then say, yeah, you know what? Hey, let's try it. And we've done that for sure. We've definitely done a lot of changing from, say, some of the other GLP-1 receptor agonists to tirzepatide. So the same company makes dulaglutide, which is, again, it's a good weekly GLP-1 receptor agonist approved for type 2 diabetes. But we've, you know, I personally, and I know a lot of people, have changed a lot of those patients over to tirzepatide and had much more benefit. Gotcha. You know, both glycemically and for weight loss and stuff like that. The little caveat that I mentioned way at the beginning was, we don't technically have the long-term cardiovascular outcome trial, and dulaglutide or Trulicity does. And so there are some patients who have, you know, very high risk. They have established cardiovascular disease where they've done pretty darn well overall. I'm like, okay, you know what? We don't really know. Let's just keep you on this. However, like I said, the analysis of all the phase 3 trials so far does show like it certainly predicts that benefit. So I've been a little bit more open to it now, if I think they really need all the other clinical benefits of the extra weight loss.
Yeah, my personal experience, which certainly can't be extrapolated beyond that, is that the clients have done so well on semaglutide, on Wegovy, and you know, are almost in a place right now, frankly, that if I'm an insurance company, like, who's, again, doesn't understand this really, like, they are incredibly healthy. Looking under the hood, like these, I've seen a lot of blood work, talked to them about, you know, interactions with the doctor. It's going incredibly well, and on the inside, they're incredibly healthy, and it's been an incredibly successful experience. You know, anywhere from 30 to 70 pounds I've seen, and yeah, I see what you're saying, where it's like, hey, for that person who's like accomplished whatever clinical goal that they had, or looks like they are going to, because things are going incredibly well, we don't have a good reason to be like, yeah, jump ship and get onto this, you know, this drug. We just don't have a good reason to go ahead and do that if things are working.
Right.
If, you know, maybe it isn't going as well, and there's a hypothetical benefit, then maybe it's open, you know, worth trying potentially. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. All right, Doc, I'm gonna let you get out of here. Drop a line. Where can people find you? Where can people interact with you on social? All of that stuff. And I appreciate your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks,
Doc. We'll speak to you soon. Let's send over that endocrine stuff, and I'd love to give it a read, and maybe we'll have you back on to kind of break some of it down.
Will do. Sounds good.
Right.
Good
Thanks
talking
a lot,
to you.
Doc. Appreciate it.